Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Safransky. um, Welcome to what I am calling theology, history, and common sense. Tonight we're talking about growing up with Pope John Paul II. And we're also going to talk a little bit about two guys you might have heard of, Francis and Burke. So in case you haven't heard, I'm doing these videos because I think that theology, history, and common sense are three things we need a little bit more of in our commentary on the church. So obviously, the thing that everyone is talking about right now in the Catholic world, or in the certain segment of the Catholic world, is the punishment that Pope Francis has handed down on Raymond Cardinal Burke, taking away his papal apartment, or his apartment in Rome, and taking away his cardinal's salary, which actually isn't as much as you might think. It's not a CEO salary, I can tell you that. And technically, he's not taking away his apartment. He's actually taking away his Vatican subsidy of the apartment. So Cardinal Burke has been told that if he wants to stay in the apartment past February, he'll have to pay market value for that. And I cannot imagine what market value of an apartment right near St. Peter's would be. So obviously a big part of the, uh, controversy, consternation about this is the fact that it's coming not too long after the dismissal of Bishop Strickland, when a lot of people are already primed to think that Francis is on a kind of anti-conservative crusade, or an anti-traditionalist crusade, might be another way to put it. And this, of course, this event with Burke just really solidifies that for a lot of people. I don't think it's hard to see why that would be. One of the things I had said when I was talking about Bishop Strickland was that, it would be evidence of a kind of, I don't want to say conspiracy, but a crusade by Francis to root out Orthodox Catholics if we saw him dismissing other Orthodox bishops, or moving against other Orthodox actors or people in the church. And it would seem that this kind of fulfills that prophecy. Now, I don't think that's quite the case. Again, I want to say why. Now, first of all, is this move by Francis? I think it's a totally legitimate question to ask whether this is kind of a fair or just move. And ultimately, I think that is something that Catholics, in good conscience, can disagree on, can debate. But it's also something, and this is one of the things that I always want to encourage people to think about when they're talking about what the Pope does, really what anyone does, other than yourself, is that obviously we don't have the whole story. We don't have all the inside information. But I still think it's a legitimate question to ask whether this is fair or just. And part of that is because the justification that we've heard come out for it is that, well, two things basically. Two things that seem to have some basis in reality. One is that Francis took these privileges away from Cardinal Burke because he's fostering disunity in the church. Now, I have a little bit of a hard time with that one, because not because I don't think Burke is fostering disunity in the church, I'll get to that in a minute, but because there are lots of men in official positions, lots of people in official positions, from bishops to prominent members of the Curia to cardinals, that you could argue are fostering disunity in the church, including some prominent actors involved in the Synod on Synodality, and others, but especially the bishops in Germany. And no kind of moves have been made against them. So that's one thing. Now, the other possible justification, the other justification we've heard is that Francis has taken this away from Burke because he is using those privileges, meaning his apartment and his salary, against the church or against the unity of the church. Now, I, I like Cardinal Burke. I like a lot of things about him. I was a Burke fan before it was cool. Okay. I you know, there are some of us in our wise old age who remember Cardinal Burke being a solid voice of orthodoxy from before Francis was Pope. And I like Burke, and I've always liked Burke. Um, I'm not a huge fan of some of the stuff that he's done during the Francis pontificate, and I think it's only fair to think about some of the things that he maybe has done that has fed into this taking away of privileges. So now this is just to say that people, some people on social media are trying to paint the action that Francis has taken against Burke as this kind of out of the blue action that was taken for no reason other than he doesn't like Burke or that Burke disagrees with him. And whatever your whole opinion of the case, I think it's right, again, to bring some common sense to this, to sort of examine whether that's really the case. Now, a couple of events, a couple of things that I would raise that Burke has done. Number one would be Burke's involvement in the dubia, right? The two sets of dubia. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with the dubia, but especially the second set of dubia that came out just this year. And here's my love-hate relationship. All of the men whose names are on the dubia, I really feel a theological and spiritual kinship with. Cardinal Sarah, Cardinal Mueller, Burke. These are all guys that I would call, I don't know, spiritual fathers. But I've never been convinced that how the dubia were written or how those men went about, presenting the dubia or writing the dubia or publicizing the dubia was really all that great. Now, the first set of dubia, I understand the content of the dubia. So if you don't know, you could try to look it up. This was the dubia that they wrote in response to the release of Amoris Laetitia, which was a synodal exhortation from a number of years ago about marriage in the church and divorce and remarriage. The issue that I have with that is the way that they were presented publicly, in a context when perhaps they should have been just presented privately to Pope Francis without bringing the public into it, at least not at first, since the function of dubia, it's supposed to be from, leaders in the church asking for clarification from the Pope. Clarification which they could then pass on to, the public or anyone listening to them. Now, the second set of dubia, if you haven't read them carefully, I would go and do it. Because, all right, here's what I'll say about the second set of dubia. I share some of the concerns that I feel like are behind those dubia, the ones that just came out this year, that basically address the synodal process as well as traditional sexual morality. But the way they are written, from my perspective, is that they are basically baiting the Pope, or they're kind of like leading questions. Like if I feel like I could rewrite the dubia to say this: "Hey Pope, are you Catholic, or do you want?" And frankly, I think that those are insulting questions to ask the Pope. There's nothing wrong with seeking clarification on theological points, and I actually think that Pope Francis showed a lot of patience in the way that he responded to the dubia. I also don't think his responses to the dubia were as crazy as some people think, but that's kind of a question for another time. Um, so I, all that to say that I think that the whole writing and publicizing of the second set of dubia was an act of rebellion and challenge to the Pope that I'm not sure I think is totally cool. And even if we think it is totally cool, it's understandable why Francis maybe in some ways would react the way he did. The other thing is Burke's very vocal criticism of the synod and the synod process, especially in the foreword he wrote to a book that was published by Tradition, Family, and Property, or TFP. So in the foreword to that book, again, I think Burke makes some really radical claims about the synod. Some claims that I don't think are really very theologically accurate or astute, where basically he claims that the word synod and synodal and the whole thing like are completely out of the blue, which is not historically or theologically accurate. But also the fact that he put his name and his forward on this book, which essentially claims that the synod and the synod process are going to lead the church into schism. Now, that is just misunderstanding what a synod is. I did a video a little while ago about the synod on synodality back when it was opening. And in that video, I talk about how a lot of the critics of the synod simply don't understand what a synod is or what it does. The synod of bishops, of which the current synod is an expression, is just an advisory body to the Pope. And so if we believe in papal infallibility, if we believe that the Pope cannot lead the church astray in matters of faith and morals, and the synod is just an advisory body to the Pope, then the synod cannot ultimately lead the church astray. Now, could there be negative effects? Absolutely. Could some people be hoping that the synod is going to turn into a kind of revolution? Yeah, absolutely. Some of the members of the synod have said that. But ultimately, the synod does not present the kind of threat that that some people think, and I think it was a serious misstep for Burke to put his name on the front of that book. So that's Burke. Who knows? Maybe in 2 weeks, when I come back and talk to you again, maybe there will be another controversial event or punishment or dismissal to talk about. But for right now, I think it's legit to question the justice of the punishment of Burke. Just especially in light of the fact that no other bishops or cardinals have been punished in this way. And I think we need to be watching if and how Pope Francis addresses other, sources of disunity in the church or situations of disunity. So that being said, I've been thinking a lot since the dismissal of Strickland, and especially since this stuff with Burke, about how we as Catholics approach the papacy in general, and specifically the way that is like showing itself in the way that we are approaching Pope Francis. And something struck me. What struck me is that a lot of the people who are critical of Francis, um, who are very outwardly critical of Francis, uh, are people essentially from my generation who either grew up in the world of Pope St. John Paul II, or John Paul II became Pope when they were very young or something like that. In full disclosure, I was born in 1983. Pope John Paul II became Pope in 1978, and he was Pope until he died in 2005. So I grew up identifying the word Pope with the face and the words and the actions of John Paul II. And I also grew up Catholic, always in the church, always a member of the church. So as a teenager, as a college student studying theology, I loved John Paul II. I absolutely loved what he stood for. I remember having, here and there not understanding something that he spoke out about or not agreeing with it. But by and large, I absolutely loved John Paul II. And what kind of struck me, and I could be wrong about this, so let me know in the comments if this is off base. But the people, for the most part, I think, who are criticizing Francis now, or let me be clear about that, openly, vocally, harshly criticizing Francis, because there's nothing wrong with criticizing a pope. There is potentially something wrong with being harsh and very open about it. But all of those people, I think, probably basically loved everything John Paul II ever did. All right, now that's a little bit of hyperbole, probably not everything, okay, but probably almost everything, unless you don't think maybe that he was enough of a proponent of the old Latin Mass. Because I know that a lot of really vocal critics of Francis are huge proponents of the old Latin Mass. And John Paul II was not, he didn't do what Benedict did with the old Latin Mass. So, and two things struck me about this. Actually, a bunch of things struck me about this. So I want to talk about a few of those. For those of us who grew up with John Paul II and loving John Paul II, loving the World Youth Days, loving his clear moral teaching, loving Evangelium Vitae, loving, what's some of the other great stuff he did? Oh yeah, Theology of the Body, loving Theology of the Body. One of the things that struck me is that in retrospect, not everybody loved him. Okay, that's one thing to keep in mind. And while that is going to ebb and flow with different popes and with any public figure, or frankly any person, I think it's worth keeping in mind that we, the John Paul II generation, not have this idea that everything that John Paul II did was perfect, and sort of comparing that to the way we perceive what Francis is doing. Okay. Because I think that, again, those of us of the John Paul II generation probably didn't know about some of the faults or flaws of John Paul II, or at least we didn't know about or aren't real conscious of things he did that met with controversy, or things that he did that people didn't like. And the reason I bring this up, and the reason I think this is so important, is because I think that one of the worst things for the church is for us to let ourselves be divided into parties. Number one, because Scripture says, I would, St. Paul, in fact, St. Paul says, I would that you all would be of one heart and one mind. Christ prays that we might be one as he and the Father are one. There's a couple of good reasons, but also because the party spirit, as it seems to express itself in the church and also in politics and in all kinds of other things, tends to make us say, I identify with this figure, and therefore everything he does is good or at least defensible. Or I don't identify with this person, and therefore nothing he does is good, and people who support him are bad. And he's bad. He's morally bad. Right? And I think that a lot of that honestly has crept into the church, but especially the sort of the public and online commentary about the church and about Francis. I think that it has to be a spirit of party and a spirit of factionalism that basically looks at Francis in an entirely negative way or in an entirely positive way, right? If anyone there are people who go in that direction, then that is also a negative thing. Looking at anyone as sort of flawless or nothing but flaws, those are both problems. And I think that we, the John Paul II generation, contribute to that, especially when we look with entirely rose-colored glasses at John Paul II. Now, the guy, he's a saint. I'm not saying he's not a saint. He's definitely a saint. But he would be the first one to tell you, I promise you, that he had faults and flaws. And some very bad things happened while he was Pope, right? I mean, number one, the abuse crisis in the church. Now, I'm not blaming him for that, but it did kind of come to a head. It did bubble up even before 2001. Those things were happening in the church, and he either didn't know about it, didn't know enough about it, or, I'm not God. I don't know. I have no judgment about whether John Paul II was culpable for any of that. But that was a huge, pretty bad thing that happened on his papal watch. Now, that's just to say I try not to be a creature of party, right? I love John Paul II, Saint John Paul II. I do not think of him as perfect and Francis as the opposite of perfect, right? And I think that can be a problem. Now, if you think I'm totally off base with how the John Paul II generation is viewing Francis, let me know. Let me know in the comments. Now, the other thing that I think is worth doing is a little study of history, right? That's one of the things that I want to bring to this, to the commentary on church events today, is a little bit of history. And that all that means in this situation, in this context, is being aware, for those of us who grew up with John Paul II and then Benedict, being aware of the fact that John Paul II was not the norm for popes in almost any way. And so frankly, if we have, I'm 40 years old, if I have 30 years of life ahead of me, I better get used to that for a couple more popes, that none of them is going to be John Paul II. So as you probably know already, just for example, John Paul II had the third longest reign in history for a pope. So those of us who grew up knowing John Paul II and only John Paul II, I feel like maybe we got the sense, even like the subconscious sense, that this is what the papacy is, that this is what not just this is what we can expect from a pope, but that this is what the pope is, right? The other thing to keep in mind is that despite the fact that a bunch of recent popes have now been canonized saints or declared blessed, that being a saint is not the norm for popes, being a canonized saint, right? Only at this point, only 84 out of more than 260 popes are saints, canonized saints. That's less than a third. So that means that we should, I mean, we want every pope to be a saint, right? We want every bishop to be a saint. We want every person to be a saint, but it's not necessarily realistic to expect that every pope is going to live up to the aura or the life of, or the theological output, the pastoral output of St. John Paul II. That's just not realistic. If you want to do some statistics, and let's see, I mean, in the 20th century, we've got St. John the 23rd, St. John Paul II, and St. Paul VI, as well as, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Blessed John Paul I, or at least Servant of God. All right. So out of our last, not including Francis, out of our last, let me count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 popes, we have 3 canonized, right? So if, let's say, if 1 out of 3 popes are saints, then does that mean we need to expect a string of 6 who aren't saints? I don't know. I mean, obviously that's taking it overboard, but just, this should kind of calibrate our expectations for a pope. The last thing I want to say about that is, related to his status as a saint and his 3rd longest reign in history, Pope John Paul II has a good claim to being possibly the most influential figure in the world during the 20th century. So if you don't know, Henry Kissinger just died, right? He was 100 years old, statesman for much of the 20th century, confidant of presidents, of popes, of world leaders, not Catholic, but he said that he believed that John Paul II was the most influential world figure in the 20th century. Just, I don't know, I have to just take a minute. When I heard that, it was brought up recently because of Kissinger's death. As some people before he died had suggested that maybe Henry Kissinger himself was the most influential figure of the 20th century, and Kissinger said no, it was John Paul II. So let's say John Paul II has a solid claim to that. Not everyone's going to say it's not unanimous, but let's say he has a solid claim to that. Well, I got news for you. That's a really, really rare thing, even among saint popes. I was trying to think about this, just doing a little bit of armchair history. And if we, sort of say we have 20 centuries of, kind of finished 20 complete centuries of church history, in how many of those centuries could you say that a pope was literally the most influential figure in the world? And just doing a little bit of sort of brainstorming, I think you would be hard pressed to say 5. I don't think you can give it to Peter because he lived in the same century as Jesus, right? So the only other ones I could think of who might have a claim to it would be Gregory the First, Gregory the Seventh, possibly Leo the First. Maybe an argument could be made for Pius the Ninth, although I think that would be, he's very well known and had a very long reign, but I'm not so sure about that one. So I think you might be hard pressed to find 5 of those. So what are the chances that in the 20th century, the most prominent figure in the world is going to be a pope? Not very likely. Okay, what is all this to say? All this is to say that those of us who've had our expectations calibrated by growing up with John Paul II, I think we need to step back, calm down a little bit, and let our expectations be recalibrated. Um, and when we let those expectations get recalibrated a little bit, we can start to think and talk. Well, we can start to think about what kind of thing really is a pope? What is the office of the pope? And most importantly, how do we interact with that person and that office given our own vocations and stations, right? Um, the first thing, and I think what I've been talking about all along kind of is building towards this, is to stand back and remember that popes are not God. Now, and I mean that from sort of a positive and a negative angle. Okay. Um, I grew up in a time, well, like I said, I was born in 1983. My parents grew up in pre-Vatican II era, and my mom, God rest her soul, who had a really deep faith, kind of you know, taught me what to think, how to think about the Pope and what he does and his role. And my mom's approach to the Pope was basically what he says goes. Um, Now, there's a sense in which that's true, in that we as lay people need to exercise religious obedience and humility, in the face of the Pope and what he says and what he writes. But if it goes overboard, then that can lead to a kind of Pope worship, right? Which is certainly not the situation that Jesus set Peter up in, and is not the right situation for any of us to be in regards to the Pope. Now, I say that as kind of the positive side of what I think is a two-sided fact or two-sided issue. The negative side of it is that when we look at the Pope as some kind of almost a divine figure, then we start to analyze everything he does and says as if our expectation is that he is God. And when he starts to falter, or at least when we think he's faltering, then we lose faith. We lose faith in that Pope, but we also lose faith in the church, and we lose faith in God. Um, I think you got to ask yourself, there are people, I know that there are people that have been driven away from the church, away from the visible communion of the Catholic Church, that they've left the church in response to things that Francis has said or done. And that happened with John Paul II as well, and Benedict and every other pope. Maybe not John Paul I. He wasn't really around long enough. God rest his soul. If anything the Pope can do would cause you to leave the Catholic Church, then you never understood what the church was, and you never understood who the Pope was. And that's a problem with the way that we view popes and the papacy. So like one thing that might be good, I think, for a lot of us to do is to read a history of the popes. One that I might suggest to you is Eamon Duffy's history. It's called Saints and Sinners, A History of the Popes. And I believe he's put out a couple versions of this. I think he's put out a new version for when Francis has been Pope. Maybe a version when Benedict was Pope, although I'm not sure. And really the title captures it all because he takes a pretty honest look at the saintly and the sinful behavior that popes have entered into. I know someone who is an extremely kind and charitable person face to face, but on Facebook becomes something else. And I remember this person not too long ago saying that Francis was the worst pope ever. And I couldn't even respond to that because all that means is that that person had never studied the popes. Okay. We've had popes who were teenagers who became pope because like his uncle was the pope, and his uncle appointed the 16 cardinals who agreed to make his nephew the pope when he died. And that teenager became pope, never wanted to be pope, never wanted to be a priest, never wanted to be a bishop, and lived an entirely corrupt secular life as pope. That's one. We've had popes write some very bad theology and some very unwise theological and pastoral writings, and put into action some very unwise policies. Now that does not contradict papal infallibility, because no pope has ever led the church definitively into error on issues of faith and morals. But guys, we've had some really bad popes. Like, even if you don't like Francis, I mean, even the things I don't like that Francis does, or I think maybe not the best decisions, I tend to read. I tend to kind of give him the benefit of the doubt. But we've had popes in the past that you could not give the benefit of the doubt to because they were open, naked power players and lustful, greedy public sinners. Like, that has happened. So, like it or not, no pope is God. In fact, no pope is anything but a man. Now, of course, every pope is given the gifts of the Spirit that are necessary for fulfilling the office that God has called him to, just like each of us. And so surely every pope is given or is offered a massive dose of the Spirit to do the things that he needs to do. But just like us, popes sometimes refuse to listen to the promptings of the Spirit, or refuse to accept the help of the Spirit. And I think we'll just be, honestly, like a happier, more united church if we just come to grips with that. If we take a kind of a long look at history and come to grips with that. Does it mean never criticizing the Pope? No. Although I think we need to think long and hard about whether it is appropriate for us to criticize the Pope the way we do sometimes in public or on social media, given whatever our stations are in life, right? Your station and your vocation. And so, I would encourage every one of us to think about, if I say something about Pope Francis with my words or in anything I post on social media, is it possible that I'm going to give scandal, right? Am I going to lead someone else? Am I going to lead them to disrespect for the office or person of the Pope? am I going to, right, I'm blacking out, so this is a good time to just point out to you guys, I'm repping the Messy Family Project here tonight. If you haven't heard of the Messy Family Project, it's a great family ministry run by a couple of friends of mine, Mike and Alicia Hernan. Google them. It's a wonderful ministry to parents and families. I'll put a link in the description when this video goes up. So, anyways, that's all I want to talk about tonight. I want to encourage you not to lose your mind. I would encourage you, before you say or write or think something about Pope Francis, or frankly any other figure, I would encourage you to just take a step back and think about it for a few minutes. I think we have a lot more to learn about Pope Francis and about what his legacy will ultimately be. A big part of his legacy, I think, may be the way he handles what's going on in Germany. Frankly, I think that will be a bigger part of his legacy than the Synod on Synodality. So we'll see what happens. And I would just encourage you to read and reflect on, if you want a Bible passage tonight, read and reflect on 1 Corinthians, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, especially chapters like 1 through 4 about division and faction in the church. And I would encourage you, even if you are certain that someone else in the church is wrong on something, please don't let that blind you to the good that they may be doing. If you disagree with Francis disciplining Burke, please don't let that blind you to the good that he is doing as Pope and has done. And ultimately, I think we should all pray for the unity of the church. One last thing I wanted to mention. Another person that I know, this is something that I got from someone I know on social media here in Steubenville, who posted, now this person is a very Orthodox Catholic, and posted how shocked she was by the hermeneutic of suspicion that people were applying to Francis. And I thought that was a great phrase to use and a great thing to point out. That's like a phrase we use sometimes if we're talking about, how do you interpret other people's actions and other people's words? And usually a hermeneutic of suspicion would be put over against a hermeneutic of charity. If I read what someone does with a hermeneutic of suspicion, then I'm always looking for and assuming the worst. If I read and look at what they do with a hermeneutic of charity, then I am trying as best I can to interpret what they do and say in a charitable lens. And along that line, I'm going to finish with one of my favorite quotes of all time. This is from St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And he said, "If it seems that your neighbor is sinning, tell yourself it must not be so. And if it becomes obvious that he is sinning, tell yourself, well, the temptation must have been very great." I will see you again in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about the document that came out of the Synod on Synodality. We'll be talking a little bit more about synodality. I will see you then. Peace.